So I'm going to talk a little bit on our contribution. Professor Okoye talked about the clinical trials at large in Africa, and I think most of some of the things that I was going to cover, she actually covered. But I will particularly talk about our participation as Africans in the global oncology clinical trials. How are we, and what are the countries that are involved right now, and on what scale, and what can we do to actually improve that? It's just adding on what Professor Koi actually talked about. So some of the repetition, I would say, because we have covered some of these. Globally, more than 60% of the new cancers are diagnosed annually in Africa, and actually this is going to, in Africa and other low and middle income countries, and actually this is really going to increase over the years, as we have seen. And about 70% of the world cancer deaths also occur in the same regions, so the low and middle income countries. And despite this huge burden in terms of cancers, there is a limited participation in clinical trials. Yet we know that clinical trials are very important in the fight against cancer, whether it's in terms of bringing innovation in screening, prevention, treatment, but also supportive care. So this limitation that we have in participating in clinical trials, actually some of the reason we are still lagging behind in contributing to the innovation in cancer care across the globe. So why are we lagging behind in terms of clinical trials? One is because even the research landscape at large in Africa is still limited for so many reasons. Recently, a group of colleagues led by Dr. Miriam Tebi from Kenya did a bibliometric analysis of cancer research in Africa for about 10 years, from 2009 to 2020. I mean, that was 12 years. And they found that African countries contributed about 24,000 publications in that 10-year period. And even those that 24,000 papers, Africa contributed 68. So you can imagine 42% of the remaining was about Africa, but led and designed and conducted by people from outside Africa. And if you go to other regions or other continents, this is not the case. If you go to Canada, you wouldn't find that about 50% of the cancer production is from outside Canada or outside US or Europe. So this shows that we still have a long way to go in terms of producing our own content and data. So even those 68% that are produced by Africans actually come from two major countries, so Egypt and South Africa. So as we can see from the data, 42% are from, the 5,281 papers of which were South Africa contribution, and as I said, Egypt is also partly contributing to most of the cancer research that we're seeing in Africa. So imagine in a region of 49 countries, two countries are producing 42% of the cancer research. It's as I said, it's still a long way to go in terms of the production of cancer research in Africa. And when you compare cancer research and other disciplines, actually, for example, infectious diseases, which has produced 5 or 6 more times the production of cancer research in Africa. So this shows that we still have a lot to do in terms of cancer research, not necessarily clinical trials, but even observational studies. And there's a lot of inequities in terms of also research. So as I said, even those that are produced from Africa, the contribution of African authors is actually very limited. We did also analysis of cancer production in one of the major journals in global oncology, the Journal of Global Oncology, part of the Journal of Clinical Oncology of ASCO. And we found that among the papers that are produced from Africa, the first and last authors are actually mostly not Africans. So you can imagine someone comes in your house, writes about you, but you're not part of the publication. So it's still a shame that more than 50% of the first authors and last authors as for research that is conducted in Africa is still by non-Africans. And why this? This is mostly, if you go and look back, this is because we have not created infrastructure, we have not trained people to actually conduct research in our region. We did this survey when I was still a resident here in Tanzania, looking at the attitude and barriers of cancer research among the trainees, so residents at Muhimbili, and most of the residents actually have good attitude towards research. They want to do research, but they lack a lot of support in terms of mentorship, training in research methodology, but also incentives such as supportive environment where they are. For example, I don't know right now, but when we were still at Ocean Road, most of the time you're invested in clinical care, and there's really minimal time for research unless if you steal from your social life and you sleep late and wake up early to do research. Otherwise, most of the time you're employed full time to do clinical work. So these are some of the challenges, but the major ones: lack of training, lack of mentorship that we don't have in our trainings, and also, as I said, the supportive environment. So clinical trials landscape in Africa, or I'd say is, as I said, and Prof. Okoye said, it's really still limited. The global clinical trial.gov is a US government website that usually puts on clinical trials that are happening all over the world. When we looked at it, there were only 917 clinical trials that were conducted in Africa. And even the majority of these, again, are also from the two countries, Egypt and South Africa. So if you go, there are some countries that there are really no clinical trial in cancer that is happening, one being Rwanda, where I come from. So we still have, some of the challenges in terms of clinical trials. But however, we are also seeing, even with South Africa and Egypt, there are still now some globalization of clinical trials, which means that some of our countries are actually participating in global clinical trials. For example, a clinical trial that is designed from the US or Canada or other high-income country, but are recruiting small numbers of participants from Africa. We are seeing this growing fast and fast. But this growth of globalization of clinical trials is really most of the time not driven by science. It's not because they want to study how the drugs are, the effect of the drugs on different, let's say, ethnic groups or races, but rather they have their own other agendas, which of course raises some ethical concerns. For example, some of the clinical trialists are recruiting patients from Africa to increase the sample size. For all of you who have done statistics, you know that if you increase the number of patients, you power your trial, and the more the likelihood that your trial is going to be positive. So that is the reason why they are, some of the time they are recruiting patients from our region. Another reason is because most of the time our environments are, not that strict in terms of ethics. So there is less oversight, and of course lower costs. A research assistant in Africa is paid less compared to someone from the US. So that is also sometimes a motivating factor for clinical trialists to come to the continent. As I said, there is fewer regulations compared to hurdles compared to the high-income countries. So all these will make low-income countries, such as those in Africa, to be very appealing to cancer trialists, which was 90% and more, as some of the speakers said, supported by pharmaceutical industries. A group of researchers at Queen's University did an analysis of contemporary randomized control trial, and they identified few themes or things that actually are very pertinent for those that are recruiting patients from low and middle income countries. I'll just highlight few, but if you want to go into details, you can read the paper. One of things that actually was found with these researchers is that even good research that come out of Africa or low and middle income countries in general are not published in high impact journals. So the journals such as the Lancet Oncology, which usually when you publish there, sometimes the study becomes a practice-changing study. But even positive trials that are coming from Africa are not really accepted in these major journals. So you ask yourself why, yet these are positive trials. So if you look at the far left, the graph shows you the positive superiority clinical trials that became positive and where they are coming from. The dark blue or dark black there shows trials that are coming from low and middle income countries. As you can see, there are many, but they are published in journals with low impact factor from 0 to 9. While those from high income countries, the light gray on my screen, or white there, there are very few, but they are published in high impact journals. So there's still inequality and inequity in terms of cancer trial results dissemination, depending on where the trials are conducted. So this, of course, raises the question of research, parasitism and parachutism, which is a concept whereby researchers from high-income countries come to our countries and collect data. They go in their countries, they do analysis, and then they don't, consider the local researchers in terms of allocation of authorship, but also they don't consider participants of the clinical trials that were involved in these clinical trials. So this brings a lot of challenges. Of course, some of you are probably aware that there are clinical trials that are conducted in our settings with suboptimal control arm. What does this mean? So for example, you're studying a drug in breast cancer, or let's say lung cancer, where immunotherapy right now is the standard of care in metastatic settings. But because in our settings we cannot afford clinical trials, they will come to study a new drug, but they compare it to cytotoxic chemotherapy because it's what we can afford in our country. But that is unethical because you're comparing your new drug that you're studying to a non-standard of care regimen. So that is what is being done. I know right now there is a trial in Kenya where they are studying a new drug in treatment of esophageal cancer, where right now we know that immunotherapy is the standard of care, but they are using cytotoxic drugs as the control arm. Another thing is, even where they study the drugs with good standard of care arm as a control arm, post-trial patients are not really, they don't access the new drug because it's very expensive. Once the drug company stops the trial, patients also stop getting the new drug that was being studied, even if the trial is positive. I'll give you some of these examples shortly. So, as I said, there are still a lot of inequalities in terms of the cancer trials that are being conducted in our region. For example, you will see a few trials in cervical cancer, yet that's our number one cancer in our region. The same applies to prostate, liver, and breast. But you see a lot of clinical trials in lung cancer, some of course in breast. So this shows you that the cancer burden and clinical trials that are being conducted do not align well in our settings. I talked about the availability of drugs. the Helsinki Declaration mandates that clinical trials, all investigator will supply the drugs after the clinical trial closes, but this is not done most of the time. There's a study that cross-section study that was done looking at FDA-approved drugs, and they found that 0% of LMIC's participant got the drug 1 year after the trial closed. 0%. So you include participants from LMICs in your clinical trial, but after 1 year, when you close your clinical trial, they cannot afford, for example, Herceptin. Yet it is becoming, it is approved and becoming a standard of care because of the participation of participants from our continent. So last year, our group looked at the participation of low and middle income countries and upper and middle income countries in the clinical trials that are led by high income countries. We wanted to look at which countries are mostly targeted when high income countries are going to recruit patients from low middle income country. What are the possible reasons? Are these reasons scientific, or are they ethically oriented? And this is what we did. So we had a database of about 630 clinical trials that were conducted from 2014 to 2017. Some of these data, actually most of these data are publicly available. And we compared countries that are involved in these trials versus the bibliometric output of these these countries. What does that mean? It means that we'll come to Tanzania and see how many clinical trials were conducted in Tanzania versus how many publications out of Tanzania. Do they align? Usually you expect that if there's many clinical trials in Tanzania, then you expect high output of cancer research in the same country. When we looked at that, these are the countries that are involved in clinical trials that are led by high-income countries from low and middle-income countries. So in Africa, as I said earlier, mostly it's South Africa and most of the northern African countries. When you look at the sub-Saharan Africa minus South Africa, you see nothing. Sometimes when I'm writing papers, I tend to remove South Africa from sub-Saharan Africa because, honestly, when you look at their contribution to science, and it's out of the region in terms of all that we do, but that's how it is. So I'm not going to go into the details of this paper, this slide, but what we found was that most of the clinical trials that are involving low and middle income countries tend to be positive trials, meaning that they come to become practice-changing trials. And most of the time, they are studying they are studied in metastatic settings, of course, because most of our patients, as most of speakers said, they are stage 3 and stage 4. And as I said earlier, most of them, despite being positive, they are published in low impact factor journals, which means that they are not going to really be disseminated in mostly compared to those that are coming from high income countries. So in terms of the burden of the disease versus the clinical trials that are conducted, as I said, cervical cancer is not in the list of the cancers that are studied. Mostly these clinical trials studied GI malignancies, colon, hepatobiliary, and lungs. But when you look at gynecological malignancies such as cervix, it's not that highly studied. And similarly to breasts and other common cancers that we see in Africa. So the alignment of the clinical trials that are conducted in Africa and the cancer burden do not really align well, because otherwise if you wanted to align them, you would be seeing a lot of clinical trials that are studying cervical cancer. Most of the studies, when you compare the clinical trials versus the research output in the research ecosystem in these countries, we found that they are really not aligning at all. So this raises a lot of questions that why would most of the clinical trials be conducted in South Africa or Egypt and not in Tanzania or Kenya or Rwanda? So the alignment of clinical trials where the industries are taking the clinical trials does not really align well with the research ecosystem in most of the countries. And these are things that Professor Okoye talked about, but I'm going to repeat them. These are some of the challenges that Africa has in terms of not leading clinical trials. Of course, one is the overwhelming clinical workload. As I said, most of us are really involved in clinical work, and we have limited time for research. And this is, of course, compounded by the lack of funding, limited health care infrastructure to conduct research, regulatory challenges that we have in our settings, and difficulty in recruiting participants for clinical trials. So most of our people will tell you, if you go to a rural area to recruit a patient, that I don't want to be an animal to study, to be your animal to study on the new drug. So some of these are challenges. Limited data management, we have those, we don't have those trainings, but also stigma and misinformation. This is almost the same as difficult in terms of recruiting participants, because there's a lot of myth around clinical trials in our settings. So what are the future directions and the recommendation that might improve clinical trials in Africa? One is having competitive grants and fellowship for African cancer research, to have local ethical framework for including local researchers in the HIC's sponsored research. So this means if someone comes from HIC and want to conduct a research in Tanzania, it's mandatory that there is a member of a Tanzanian on that clinical trial. Otherwise, should not be allowed. That will help us to build capacity for future clinical trialists. Of course, invest in education and mentorship for African researchers, and this should be starting from low level, undergraduate studies, postgraduate, but also PhD and postdoc level. Provide incentives for clinician researchers. So I should be allowed to do my clinical duties, but also have protected time for research if I am interested in doing research. Of course, establish African-led cancer research agenda. As I said, most of the research that is being conducted in Africa actually not led by Africans, as we saw from the inequalities and inequities in the allocation of authorship. So we should be guiding our agenda in terms of research. I would say that we should have put a priority in terms of where we disseminate our research. We should empower our local journals. If we have, for example, Tanzania Oncology Society journal, we should be giving emphasis on that journal instead of looking to publish in the Lancet Oncology or Journal of Global Oncology or other prominent high-income countries' journals. Of course, strengthen South-to-South collaborations. We are here. We have people from Ghana, Sudan, Rwanda. I was interacting with people from Malawi and Zambia. So these are collaborations that are, to me, very beneficial than, waiting for someone who is going to fly 100 miles from high-income country to partner with us. Finally, I know that Professor Hamad is going to talk about involvement or interaction with pharma and some of the ethical consideration in that. But I think we are not going to work, to get rid of pharma in our work, but we need to find ways to partner well with pharmaceutical companies so that, the public-private partnership will push the clinical trial forward to benefit our patients. And with that, I would like to thank you.